we're going to take a look at some of the content-aware tools in Photoshop and some things that might be better to do by hand. Let me just quickly show you some of the things that content-aware is capable of. It basically looks around the image and tries to find stuff to drop into different places. Like, let's say I had the sky selected here and I didn't want the sky. I could choose Edit, Fill, and for contents I could use Content Aware. Give it a few seconds to think. It looks around the image, tries to figure out what it thinks should go into those different places, and then it gives you some kind of weird piece of modern art. So it found some of this, it found some of this, and yeah, made some weird decisions. But given what I told it to do, not bad. It's usually not too bad in things like grass, rocks, like forests off in the distance. Where it tends to fall apart is in things that have repeating patterns, like man-made objects. It's often not that good with. You can see the nice vertical lines on the boards in the barn here. You get weird little offsets and things don't quite join up. If there was like a cityscape, like a building, maybe you're trying to get rid of somebody climbing on a building and there's like a weird perspective on it, it often gets messed up by things like that. But where it can help you out is providing a starting point for stuff. This is my son from a few years ago. He's 11 now, but this is him a long time ago. Let's say I wanted to get rid of him. Not that I would, but let's say I did. If we just grab the patch tool here, and if we leave it in the source, here's the source of what I want to get rid of, and drag it somewhere else. And just like with the clone stamp, you want to make sure that you get the lines lining up, the height right, things like that. When I let go, it looks at the information here. I said, take this stuff and put it over here. And for the most part, it does okay. It got a little messed up by the fact that when I selected around the top of his head, I accidentally went into the grass on the other side, so you got a little bit of brightness in here. And watch out for kind of the giveaways for where something's been done. Like this little dark patch of grass is exactly the same as this dark patch of grass with these two little white points here and here. When something is really noticeable, like they're noticeably the same thing, it's kind of a dead giveaway that something's been done. It'll try to match up brightness, it'll try to match up contrast and color balance, but you're basically taking this texture and dropping it right over top of there. And also, if there's something in the scene, think about how it would be interacting with the scene. Like when he was standing there, he was casting a shadow. Well, obviously the shadow would have to go as well. So always think about how that thing would be interacting with the scene around it. Would it be making a shadow, a reflection? If it's something really brightly colored, would it be reflecting that color into the background? So always kind of take those things into account. Now, the selection that I made with that tool doesn't have to be made with that tool. In fact, any of the selection tools can be used. Like I could switch to the lasso tool here, and let's say I went to, maybe I didn't want to get that grass across the way there. I could choose subtract from selection, and I could remove those little bits from the selected area. If I wanted to get the shadow in there, I could go to add to selection, and I could tell it, well, let's also include the shadow in the selected area. So you can use whatever tools you want to make those selections and then select whatever tool you need. In this case, we got the patch tool, drag it over, and it does its best to blend everything in there. So that's if you want to get rid of something. Maybe you want to go the other direction and say, well, when I'm cutting this out, I'm hitting the top, or in the case of this second one, where he's a little bit lower in the frame, he just kept running. So I said, okay, well, let's take this, drop it over top of here, and patches it in. You may find that it may be easier to actually grab a source of texture. So say instead of selecting him, if we go to destination, and we grab a little section of the grass here, we could drag that over top, and it will blend that in afterwards. Ooh, although, look at the mistake I made. In the bottom corner there, I didn't quite get his arms, and it saw the blue. This was outside of the selection. It said, okay, well, it must want some blue across there. So do make sure you get the whole thing selected. You got a bit of a dark patch here because of that dark sleeve there. Again, we can modify this. I could say, well, let's add this to the selection as well, and add this to the selection. Move this over. And that should get a bit of a better job. And notice how it tries to match up the brightness. What I dragged over is a little bit lighter than the rest of the area, but it'll look towards the outside and it will match up that brightness in there. And like I said, sometimes you can kind of think of it as a starting point. So if you notice that there was something that was really the same, like this little blob here and this little blob here are pretty much the same, well, you could just grab your clone stamp and you can say, okay, well, let's just get rid of that one there, make it something else. So you can kind of break up that repeating pattern in there. If you just hit J on the keyboard, it'll take you to where they hide out. And you'll notice there's a little arrow in the corner by the icon. Click and hold, you'll get a flyout, and there's all the different tools that are in there. And you might have noticed that there's another tool in there called the Content Aware Move tool. Maybe compositionally you thought that it would be better if he was somewhere else in the frame. Same sort of deal. If you grab the Content Aware, make a selection around, drag him somewhere else. When you let go, or when you hit the return, oh, I put him a little bit low. Let me move him up a little bit. When you hit the return key, it will blend him into his new location on the left, and it'll look around and try to fill in where he was on the right using the Content Aware features. Again, watch out for stuff like those repeating patterns. Like, actually, that did not too bad of a job. Actually, that's not too bad. Yeah, there you go, I was being overly critical. But if something did stand out to your eye, you could just grab a clone stamp and you could go in and clean it up. Take a look inside the folder at the third image down. And let's see if we can use that Content Aware tool. And again, ideally when you're doing your photography, you'll compose in the camera and everything will be fantastic. But maybe you wait a little too long on the shutter and this swan was swimming across and you wanted it there. But now it's over here. See if you can move this swan and stick it over there. You could try the Content Aware Move tool. So if you were to select the swan, okay, somebody noticed my mistake. Remember I said always think about how something is going to be interacting with the scene? Okay, I moved the swan, I didn't move the reflection. Do you think that would be enough? Let's say I undid this and I added to the selection. Let me get that reflection as well. And then I grab the Move tool and I drag it over to there. What do we think? Is that convincing? It's better, isn't it? Although, there's a couple things that this kind of shows. First off, it does, to a certain degree, a fairly crappy job. Like if I zoom in on the job where it patched the the swan, look at what's going on here. The water itself has a very kind of ripply, kind of long, kind of stretched wavelength to it. And yet we have these hard cut lines around the outside. You could play around with a feather radius on the selection, but the software just isn't great at knowing how these things are supposed to go, at kind of anticipating what it should be looking like. You guys are probably better. Just like with like those spot healing brushes and stuff, you know what nostrils look like. You know what the contours around ears and eyes look like. The software doesn't. So you may need to go in and do a little bit of cleaning up afterwards. But also, this swan is sitting in the water. He's, paddling his little feet around. And if you look at where he came from, ignoring the fact that the patch job is, well, pretty rough, look what we've got going around here. There's further evidence that this swan had been over here. So I would need to take more of this. Would that be enough? I mean, if you step out even further, look at this. We have some ripples around here. Always think about how something is going to be interacting in the scene. In the case of waves, just like light follows the inverse square law, there'll be strongest waves around here. The farther out they get, the weaker they get, but they're still there. They're still noticeable. In fact, if I really did want to move that swan from the left side to the right, I would probably have to have photographed it a little bit wider than I did. Like that's the composition as it came out of the camera, and I think it was an iPhone 4, so it's not like it was a super high res. But if I had shot wider, let's say I'd done like this, I could probably have taken this section, popped it up, moved it over, and probably fairly convincingly dropped it with the duck over there. A little bit more of the incentive for shooting wider than you think you need. But in the case of this, what I've got now, I probably don't have enough information to do a convincing job of pulling this swan over and dropping it in that place. I'd probably have to bring so much of this background that it wouldn't make sense with the darkness of the sand underneath and things like that. So be careful with your compositions and don't think you can just rely on these tools to bail you out. All right? Play around with it. See what you can do about getting that around. Or see if you can get rid of my daughter, Stephanie. Again, sounds wrong, but just play around with it. Have some fun with the tools. See what they're capable of and see what their limits are. What if I just took the, say, a lasso tool, kind of the same idea, took way more than I thought I would need, popped it up onto a new layer, moved it over, and with a layer mask, brought it back. And I don't even know if this would be enough to make it convincing. Yeah, there's a few flaws, but that's just doing it by hand. That's not relying on Photoshop at all. That's just saying, how would I do this myself? So it carried these over, but they're still here as well. You could say, well, maybe it's the really latent echo of from way over there, but no, it's... Physicists would not fall for it.